gaming reviews done quick. I'll be faster than you and the night. Welcome to the 1 Minute Rundown. I'm OC Trinity, your host, and being a man, I guess that makes me a miserable little pile of secrets. This time we're running down part 2 of Castlevania. We already talked about the open world platformers that seem to have the biggest following, but the more recent history has gone into 3 dimensions, usually inspired by more traditional hack and slash games or perhaps adventure games. This is one that's a bit harder to pin down a general concept for, since most of these seem clearly inspired by something else but given a Castlevania overhaul. Of course, one thing hasn't changed much. You're taking the role of a vampire hunter with a vendetta against Dracula, even if the protagonist, their fighting methods, and the time period of the game change each time. But some more common elements include experience points, side weapons, an emphasis on exploration, and an atmosphere inspired by just about every major monster story in the past 2 millennia. I'll talk about 6 games this episode. Let's get started, shall we? This isn't technically a first foray into 3D for the series, but it's more of a polished attempt at it. I say attempt because I don't think they quite got what they were looking for. The game's closer to a 3D platformer, not completely unlike Legend of Zelda with a jump button, until around the 40% mark where it turns into more traditional platformer of the reach the end of the level and maybe fight a boss variety. And honestly, I don't think it pulls off either of those well, and a lot of it's for the wrong reasons. The camera feels like even after trying to manually adjust it can't get into a viewpoint I'm comfortable with. The controls feel awkwardly placed due to items and the quick attack, which are placed in the middle of the N64's face buttons, feeling like I was actively trying to find someplace they were useful, and between the game feeling a bit sluggish and Cornell's stronger long-range attack being the only one that seems consistently useful, combat ends up being fairly uninteresting. It's not till close to the end of the game where it becomes all about the platforming, where the game really shows a level of game design talent. I was actually surprised to learn this one had a following. If you ask me, that shows a large group of people can all be wrong. The next Castlevania chose not to follow the last game and instead turned into a Devil May Cry clone, but with Castlevania's items, non-linearity, and unexpectedly high number of secret areas. Leon is a whip user with the traditional side weapons of older Castlevania games and learns new skills along the way. Repeated use of combos gives you new ones, and defeating a boss, which by the way can be attempted in any order, gives you an orb that changes how side weapons work. There's also some magic spells that provide support effects, as well as elemental whips, but most of these are hidden away so well that collecting them feels like an afterthought. The locations also get a bit maze-like simply because many of the rooms look identical, but they do all give the wings of the castle a different feel. And while combat is very well designed and has that frantic, twitchy feel I would expect from an action game, the number of attacks you'll use seems low in comparison with similar games. But the fact remains, I get pretty much what I would want out of a game like this. It's got both the high-energy, adrenaline-inducing elements of an action game, and the atmosphere and replayability Castlevania is known for. Curse of Darkness is similar to, but less platform-oriented and more combat-oriented than Lament of Innocence was, for better or worse. It does variety better, as you'll not only use multiple weapon types throughout the adventure, but you'll do so alongside an ally. Hector happens to be a Devil Forge Master, which allows him to create and customize a few monsters, along with the item crafting you would expect from a regular Forge Master. What it doesn't do better is group combat, as locking onto enemies tends to make the camera act erratically, and finding the right target in a large group is difficult to pinpoint. Experience points and leveling up are back in, as are exploration elements, mostly in the form of maze-like levels that could have been improved simply by having fewer of those long, empty corridors, or making them shorter. This is a game I generally like, but I think what they were aiming for is something centered around the fighting that, while good, isn't as good as more recent games, and all more progress tends to change is which enemies you're fighting against, which doesn't change fast enough. But in shorter, segmented quantities, it's still a game I would recommend. Castlevania has enough fun and varied characters that a fighting game spin-off has a lot of potential, and the fact that this was the best they could come up with is a big disappointment. Looking just at the character roster, the fact that there's some very well-liked characters not on the list should tell you they didn't think everything through, and for that matter, the characters themselves were redesigned in such a way that most probably wouldn't even be identifiable if their names weren't given at the top there. But what about the actual game? It's coming from the Power Stone school of fighters with free movement, interactive environments, and a few classic Castlevania items thrown out there. It's also got one of the smallest lists of skills in any fighting game ever, to the point where most of the time you're just using the same 3 or 4 combos over and over again because each character only has 3 or 4 combos, with very few opportunities to string them together into something impressive. Never mind the occasional dodge roll that definitely didn't go in the direction I pressed. It took me several hours to find any depth with the fighting, and even then it's about as deep as a coffee mug. My final judgment? Skip this one. Lords of Shadow is a separate continuity, so let's keep that in mind as we point out that this doesn't look much like the Castlevania we know. We have a few side references and reimaginings of previous characters, and the side weapons still exist, but past that we have a game clearly trying to be God of War, except 3 levels where it's instead trying to be Shadow of the Colossus. But even though it's trying to rip off these other games, it does so in a way that makes it clear they knew what they liked from them. Gabriel is able to cash in experience points and learn new skills, and does so at a brisk enough pace that you'll go into most missions with something new. Magic that augments your attacks is available and replenished by getting streaks of hits without getting damaged yourself. The combat in the game is top-notch, but the rest needs a little polish, as the platforming, climbing, and puzzle segments seem just okay, and the Chupacabra missions are just annoying. I also thought the game ran a bit long for what it was offering, and didn't bother with side objectives that open up after completing the missions normally, but the fact remains, I enjoyed most of my run through this. Not surprisingly, this is running off the same engine and mechanics as last time, so combat's pretty much the same, aside from more variance in magic, as the concept is the same, but they actually involve using a different weapon altogether. You're still gaining experience points to buy new skills, but there's a second experience meter gained simply by using each of your skills enough times. And as you've likely noticed, Gabriel will be progressing through some modern environments with the occasional trip back to the castle. We also have some stealth missions that feel out of place and generally too slow compared to the rest of the game. Speaking of which, as much as the platforming and climbing in the last game could use some improvement, this time it managed to feel worse. Puzzle elements are heavily downplayed, side objectives are moved to a separate arena section, the excessive cutscenes make it feel like they were trying to tell a story that feels like it's missing too many details to really make sense. Overall, I feel like they improved on the combat elements while the rest stayed the same or got weaker, but let's face it, that's what you'll probably be doing the most of anyway, so if you like Lords of Shadow, you'll like this one too. While perhaps not the best example, a game series that changed styles and genres this many times brings up an interesting question. When can a game afford to make such drastic changes? I mean, like it or not, when people see a recognizable name, they're going to come in with some expectations. For example, when most people see Sonic, they expect a fast-paced platformer. If the next Sonic instead plays like God of War, there's gonna be some outcry. Now, some of my longtime viewers may notice I've given some games that were sort of a black sheep in their series good reviews, but I'm not the only one they need to sell the idea on. I mean, there's some games out there that probably would have done better if they were released as a new franchise altogether. Castlevania perhaps got lucky since it realized classic platformers were falling out of popularity by the time Symphony of the Night and the first N64 Castlevania were in development, so they tried something different, yet close enough to the original, and in part based on something they tried when the idea of what a game sequel should be hadn't been standardized. A sort of gradual shift, if you will. Resident Evil's another series I can point to for a different kind of gradual shift. If you took the first and last game, they wouldn't seem too much alike, but if you look at the games in between, you can see the change from survival horror to third-person shooter. But in more sudden shifts, one way to fix that is to make it clear that you're not abandoning the old games. Look at Metroid. They got a lot of people upset when they announced Metroid Prime was going to be a first-person shooter, but it was also known they were making the more traditional Metroid Fusion at the same time. Similarly, Mario's been in kart racers, RPGs, and board games, among others, but they're explicitly marketed as spin-offs developed alongside the platformers he's best known for, and most of those manage to feel distinctly Mario-ish. And really, that's the point I'm trying to get across here. Game designers need to realize what it is that most defines their product, or what people most like about it, and make sure that's still intact in whatever they try next. Personally, I like to see games that try something new. Just, make sure that if you're doing it as part of an existing IP, do so in a way that won't alienate your fan base. Alright, getting out of this castle now, but some of you might be thinking, what about Castlevania 64, the first one? Well, Legacy of Darkness actually has an approximation of it as an unlockable, though I'm told it's not completely identical with the level design. There was also a cancelled 3D Castlevania for the Dreamcast called Castlevania Resurrection, but it was abandoned before it got too far along. In terms of re-releases, Lament of Innocence is on PSN, and Lords of Shadow has a re-release that also contains its 2D counterpart and interquel in the storyline Mirror of Fate. Check the archives for what Castlevania's a bit better known for critically, open-world platformers, and check later for another review on how it all got started. And of course, check back soon for the next episode of 1 Minute Rundown. Castlevania is an old series adapted to have newer game mechanics, so I'll try the reverse next time, a new series with a modern take on old school style. Speaking of old school, I've got a plate of wall chicken with my name on it, so see you then. Summon the power. I call forth from the abyss the most powerful force known to all men and some women, at least of childbearing age. The power of boobies! Yo, we gotta give me the box again. We gotta rescore this. Come on.